I don't consider myself exclusively a jazz musician, especially living in Detroit. Any musical employment is fair game, as long as it involves playing or writing on the piano or keyboards. There's a lot of people who do the top work in town are basically jazz musicians. Because jazz musicians know the most about the mechanics, and they can produce when asked to.
Today, pianist Gary Schunk, recognized as one of the most versatile musicians in the Motor City. Although his first love is jazz, Schunk is a multifaceted player who refuses to put himself into a box. He's worked the pop music field with such performers as Gladys Knight, Donna Summer, and The Temptations. He appears regularly with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and he's one of the busiest recording studio sidemen in all of Detroit. But he's quick to tell you, he is a jazz man, first and foremost. Over the years, Gary Shunk has played with Sonny Stitt, Pepper Adams, Harry Sweets Edison, Earle, and his work with Mark Murphy on the LP, The Nat King Cole Songbook, helped win the vocalist a Grammy nomination in 1985. Shunk also leads a group of his own, and appearing with him on Jazz Masters is bassist Jack Dryden.
Shunk is probably one of the greatest pianists around. You know, because he can do it all. You know, he's. I hate to say this, but for a white boy, he sure can play. You know, but Gary has really had. You know, he has really studied the music. You know, he's really been into and every aspect of it. You know, he doesn't shirk any responsibilities of the music, and you know, and he's always querying me about my feelings all the time too. So he keeps me on my toes. I love Gary. Yeah.
So in coming into playing jazz, I guess some of the various arenas folks come to jazz from might be the church or gospel or the classical arena. Were there some preconceived notions, you coming from the classical background, that you had to ditch so that you could get into playing a jazz piano?
Right. Right, that's true in the largest part because jazz is group music, and a lot of times you're playing with, well, for one thing, a drummer. And let's say something we're doing today, I can exploit a lot more classical touch because we only have bass to deal with, and I'm the predominant instrument. When pianists started playing with groups, they had to play louder to compete with the volume. But now today you have instruments that can compensate for that, microphone setups that kind of negate that problem for a pianist playing an acoustic instrument.
So when you pick your tunes, and maybe there's a tune that you want to exploit this notion of the piano forte, the soft and the louder sounds, give us an example of that.
Let's take the old standard, Laura. Beautiful melody. If I go up like that, I might want to hit a chord or something that will stick out more. But when I can come back to the melody in a little more caressive style. Another thing important is rhythm. Sometimes when you're playing a standard, the rushing of certain notes of the melody, the delaying of notes creates an effect. And if you know the tune, what I look for in a pianist, jazz pianist, is using those, you know, mutations of melody and rhythm to change the song, you know, to make it more of a jazz interpretation. This is what students come to me for. They ask for that. How can I make this sound? And I tell them, you know, to do these things. And I, you know, basically teach them by example. And it becomes very clear that way.
So you sit down there and you say, look,
yeah,
follow me.
Yeah, it's not basically rote because they can't copy, you know, verbatim what I do. It is more of an example and pick out the salient points that I'm doing, and I point those out, the general points that I'm doing in interpreting a song, and say, well, okay, take this column A and, you know, 1A and 1B, and use that when you play your selection.
So knowing that one of the you just can't get away from the fact that if you're playing jazz, you have to establish your own voice, right? So in establishing your own voice, you had to bring some of your classical background to the music, right?
Technique is indispensable.
All right.
The best jazz pianists, or the ones closest to my taste, are those who are more studied. But I like other players too. You know, that would be emphasized by people like, you know, Horace Silver or Les McCann, who play what they know. You see, they're ear players who learn music, the mechanics of music, pretty much themselves. But you can tell by their playing, they're not as, well, you know, when you hear Oscar Peterson, he's all over the place. You can tell that there's a lot of very intense study that went on when he was younger. But I appreciate both styles, and they're both extremely valid.
So when you go from, let me try it this way. This requires you to give an example,
Okay.
so think quick. Now,
All
I know you can do that. There's, pick a tune, you can perform that tune in a so-called classical style.
Okay.
And then you can perform that tune in a so-called jazz style. And let's see what the differences sound like. What tune do you want to pull?
Let me see. Let's, how about In Your Own Sweet Way, Dave Brubeck. Classical style?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll do this one alone. Very straight with a lot of what we call filigree, which is a lot of filling up the harmony of the song. In a rhythmic jazz style, I'm going to do it with the bass, it would be a bit more abstract, especially the modern style of piano, which I believe anything after, any players who came up after 1963 or 4, it's the same thing. I might not even play the melody, you know. I might refer to it in a couple of notes, but maybe not play the melody till the end. The modern style is a lot more abstract than, let's say, players from the 50s, Hank Jones or Tommy Flanagan. They're much more literal in playing the melody, playing it rather straight with, you know, jazz accompaniment. The more modern players will abstract even the melody and the harmonic components of the song, and just leave the basic structure. Now, even what I did there was pretty much inside. I could go way far afield from that, you know, but for sake of brevity, you know, you try to, you know, make things understandable. So I try to do that so listeners can follow pretty much the bass line, and through the bass line, you know, he supports what I'm doing in the left hand.
So what do you require in a bass player?
Oh, the bottom. You know, the bottom is, you know, paramount, obviously. Working in intimate settings, though, bass is really freed up to fill out parts of the chord. With modern techniques of bass, he's not stuck to just playing 4 to the bar like a walking bass line. We have what's called broken fields up where you might walk for a while and then go, when we go on positions on the bass, far up on the D or G strings to kind of comment on what I'm doing, if I'm doing something that makes him, you know, want to react. A rhythm or a little motif or something, anything. It might just be just a fleeting moment, you know.
I want to know if you can demonstrate that kind of floating technique and with the interaction of the bass with another composition, perhaps.
Okay, what were we going to do? Oh, If You Could See Me Now.
Well, now you get a chance to put yourself in keyboard history by there's a style that you evolved, and being a conscientious human being, you would probably say something like, I'm always evolving. But there's a style you've evolved which fits in some kind of place.
Right.
And there's some styles on the left and styles on the right of you. Can you give us an idea of what you feel is on one side of you or on the other side of you and where you fit, if we can describe it that way?
I've thought about this recently. I'm most affected by, or I originally was most affected by those who, at the time we're talking now, are like 10 years my senior. Because those were probably the first real pianists I heard playing, modern jazz. And the sound struck me as extremely sophisticated. And when I first heard a record, I believe I heard the Herbie Hancock Maiden Voyage album. When it came out, it was 1965, I was 12 years old. And it didn't even sound like music. It sounded like some kind of ordered sound that was just cosmic in its, organization. I had no idea what it was. And later heard some Bill Evans and like players who were, of that age then. And that's all I knew for quite a while. And I believe I was most affected in my playing style by those players, who are now in their 40s or late 40s. And through that, through further investigation, it's a foregone conclusion. You will find out about who their influences were. So now you go back another decade to the people who are 10 years their senior, who are now in the 60s or late 50s. You would talk about Hank Jones, Tommy Flanagan, people of that era. And then all the way back then through investigation, through the beginnings of the music.
What are some of the movements that have occurred with the piano that you feel are most critical for the 20th century?
In jazz piano?
Yeah.
Well, probably the single person. You can bring them to single people. I mean, the single person who brought jazz out of the swing era was Bud Powell. Who typified a style that really emphasized the right hand alone. He didn't play much left hand. He could if he wanted to. That kind of ushered in a new era because the bebop thing was so pervasive that everybody wanted to play bebop lines. You had alto sax players. They couldn't play alto sax because Charlie Parker played alto sax. They had to play tenor sax or something. And piano, well, we want to play like Bird too, so they transferred that to the piano. That's probably the biggest development in changing jazz piano. After that, I think the lyrical thing that Bill Evans did in the 50s and early 60s changed it again to the fact that, that you could use more of the colorful tones on the piano and use a little more of a full sound than Bud Powell had, and explore a lot more different moods. I think Bill Evans used the pedal on the piano a lot more in more creative ways than like the beboppers did. They were mainly concerned with music as notes, I think, and energy, because the original beboppers played with a lot of energy. I think anybody who wants to play bebop, let's say in the 90s, has to recreate the same energy, let's say, that Bird had, to make it work. And there are young guys doing that. Yeah. Christopher Holliday and some other people who are really investigating bebop seriously. Well, but back to the piano, Bill Evans and all his progeny, who came out of that, all the players who came up in the 60s who and own all their records, all those guys you know, are really descendants of two people, Bud Powell and Bill Evans.
Can you favor us with a composition again, with another piece? It can be an original if you like.
This is something I wrote called a Nova a while back. I consider it classical sounding. Kind of has a similarity to some of the things that you might hear on the ECM record label, you know, which it doesn't necessarily swing in a jazz rhythm. It floats more, like what we call eighth note, which every note is straight. It isn't what we call syncopated, you know, like the swing rhythm is.
Well, we thank you for joining us with Jazz Masters, Keepers of the Flame. We know you're going to keep the flame.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peace. Our guests for Jazz Masters, Gary Shunk, piano, Jack Dryden, bass.